Everybody. Okay, so like I said, today I'm just going to take a real quick look at how we would analyze the Epic of Gilgamesh according to Joseph Campbell's ideas. One point or problem I noticed you guys had in the discussions previously was it's very easy to mix up Gilgamesh and Utnapishtim. We last looked at the Epic of Gilgamesh when we were looking at the flood story, and that's one of the most famous stories in Gilgamesh, but it's just one part of Gilgamesh. Um, so uh, Utnapishtim is the guy who survived the flood. Gilgamesh is just a guy who meets him along that way. So Gilgamesh didn't get involved in the flood. So the flood story is about Utnapishtim. But you could argue that Utnapishtim's story follows kind of a heroic pattern. But today we'll be focusing on Gilgamesh. And who was Gilgamesh? Well, he might have been a real person, actually. This was back in ancient Sumeria, pre-Babylonian times, although the story was told again and again, so it was told in Babylon as well. Um, it's the story of a king who has to go on this journey and tries to solve a problem he encounters. But I think it's important to notice that at the beginning of the story, Gilgamesh is not the nicest guy. He's described as making people work horribly and painfully, and making all the women sleep with him. He's just a bad dude in general. He's not a nice guy. So I think just because he's a hero doesn't necessarily mean that his actions are what we would today in the modern sense call, quote, heroic. Um, I also think that if he's in a kind of a bad person at the beginning of the story, that might be part of the way the story works. That maybe it's a sign that he needs to learn a lesson, right? Because the hero's journey is all about growth. So maybe Gilgamesh as a person needs to grow. Okay, so what's his inciting incident? What's his call to adventure? The book goes about this a little bit differently than I would, but the call to adventure is the moment where something happens to change somebody's life, to change the hero's life and put them on the path to doing something different, to going off on some kind of journey or trying some new kind of experience. And for Gilgamesh, I think that's the moment where he meets Enkidu. So Enkidu is this wild man sent by the gods. He was sent by the gods because Gilgamesh was getting too out of control, and the people were praying to the gods to help him. So the gods create someone who can be a rival to him, and this is Enkidu. He's described as wild and hairy, kind of animalistic. But the priestess Shamash takes care of Enkidu and cleans him up a fair bit, teaches him to behave himself as a normal member of society, so gets him out of the wilderness and cleans him up. And then Enkidu challenges Gilgamesh. And ultimately, by fighting each other, Gilgamesh and Enkidu become best buddies. They end up becoming really close friends. In fact, in some versions of the story, it's said that they're lovers, not just friends. So Gilgamesh, now he has this partner, this best bud. Okay, and so that's going to lead him off to go on an adventure. The crossing of the first threshold, the threshold into the world of adventure, I would say that's when they go into the forest. And if you wanted to, you could make the call to adventure when Enkidu says, let's go off and go into the forest and have sort of an adventure. But I like to put it when he arrives too, because basically it's the same thing. It's Enkidu coming and changing Gilgamesh's life. So Enkidu and Gilgamesh go into the forest. Now the book suggests there's a bit of a refusal of the call implied here. And that's when Enkidu says, I am paralyzed. Enkidu says, I hear there's a monster in here, and maybe we should turn back. But going. So ultimately, that's how the call is affirmed. And like I said, the refusal of the call doesn't have to be anything too much more complicated than that. Okay. So they go into the forest. But before that, I would argue there's a meeting with the goddess. Now, meetings with the goddess, usually we talk about them as part of the revelation or the climax of the story, but sometimes you can have this recurring thing throughout of meeting with a goddess. You can also have a recurring thing throughout of atonement with the father. And so I think Gilgamesh meeting with the goddess, the first time we see this is with Gilgamesh's mother, yes. So she helps Gilgamesh on his way, and so they're starting the journey off right. And Gilgamesh is drawing on the resources of his mother and drawing on this magical power of his mother. So you could also call this supernatural aid to get across the first threshold. And I don't know if you have threshold guardians here. I think it's more that you have this character in the forest. But let's see. The next appearance is the monster Humbaba. He's this big old ogre or giant or monster that Gilgamesh is going into the forest to slay. I would argue that that's a version of atonement with the father. Because it doesn't necessarily have to be reconciliation. It can be defeating the father. And here we have this big, very male, masculine, powerful enemy that Gilgamesh is going to take on. That's Humbaba, and he successfully defeats him. So that's pretty good. Let's see. What do we not want to put next? Okay. But the story continues from there. So we have another encounter with a goddess after Gilgamesh slays Humbaba. And this is Ishtar, also known as Inanna. But this seems kind of like it might actually be goddess as temptress, the negative side of the goddess. Because Ishtar wants Gilgamesh to sleep with her, but he says, no, you're a monster, you just use men up, you don't really love them, you destroy them. So Gilgamesh's interaction with Ishtar shows that he has a sort of negative view of Ishtar. And that's interesting, because the first goddess that he met was his mother, and he had a very positive relationship with his mother, but he has a very negative relationship with this potential love interest. Do you know people like that? Have you encountered someone who is like close to their mother but has a hard time interacting with women in full-grown relationships? It seems like Gilgamesh might be kind of immature here. That's just one way to think about it, one way to look at it. But things go bad with Ishtar. Because he insults her, she decides to destroy him. For instance, she sends the Bowl of Heaven down to destroy him. And Gilgamesh slays the Bowl of Heaven. But now Gilgamesh has offended the gods. And so that's bad news, because you can't just kill the Bowl of Heaven and get away with it. So what do the gods do? They make Enkidu get really sick. They send down a disease to kill Enkidu. So he dies, and Gilgamesh is very sad about the death of Enkidu. If you want to, you could say this is another call to adventure, maybe. Basically, Gilgamesh wants to find immortality. He experienced this great tragedy where his loved one died, and he's really broken up by death, and he's maybe suffering for the first time in his life and experiencing this suffering. So he's going to go off and try and find the way to become immortal. He's heard there's a place that you can do that. So in a way, his adventure kind of starts over. You don't have to have the call to adventure here. You could say that the call to adventure at the start is just the start of everything. But let's put that in parentheses as a possibility here. So sometimes there is repetition in these stories. Just bear in mind that they have to fill a certain function. The call to adventure always has to be about something that changes what you're doing and gets you out the door. And so Gilgamesh crosses another threshold. He goes into the mountains. and basically he's going to the ends of the earth. And here he meets these threshold guardians, which are the scorpion men. They go away, so he has to overcome them. But then Gilgamesh gets through the mountains and through this sort of darkness that he has to walk through, not knowing what he's doing. He has to go on this road of trials, basically. So he has to go through this. But when he gets to the end of it, I would say he meets a goddess for the third time. I mean, literally in the story he meets a goddess. But I also think it works for Joseph Campbell's thing. And this is Siduri, the alewife. In Mesopotamia, women are associated with beer making. So Siduri is a goddess of beer and wisdom. And he meets with her, and she's more of a love interest type goddess. And this time, he has a very positive relationship with her, and she's able to help him and give him advice and instructions how to meet a guy named Utnapishtim who's going to show him the way. So that's when Gilgamesh meets with Utnapishtim. And I would argue that this is another encounter with the father. Because Utnapishtim, the flood guy, is like this wise old man who can give Gilgamesh help. He could also be an instance of supernatural aid. But I like to think of him as a kind of father figure for Gilgamesh, because again, there's struggle with him. Well, okay, there isn't quite struggle with him yet. It's more that he represents this positive father figure. But before Gilgamesh really has this positive relationship with Utnapishtim, he also interacts with this other guy, who is, let's see, Ushanabi? Yeah. So Ushanabi runs this boat, and the boat is going to take Gilgamesh to where the plant of immortality is. But Gilgamesh has kind of a mixed relationship. He wrestles with Ushanabi, even though he doesn't have to. He basically kills him because they get into a fight on the boat. So it seems like at this point, Gilgamesh isn't really able to have a positive relationship with these male father-type figures. But later on with Utnapishtim, he is actually going to be able to. Okay, so Gilgamesh is going along the road of trials, and what he finally arrives at is an elixir. And the elixir is the plant of life. But tragically, Gilgamesh fails to bring the plant back home. It gets eaten by a snake. And the snake now has the power to be young forever and to be immortal. And the way this works is that the snake can shed its skin. And so the snake is this creature that has immortality. But human beings don't have that kind of immortality. So it's a story about human limitations. You know, Gilgamesh tries to change the way human existence is, but he's ultimately unsuccessful. But at the same time, he came really close to the elixir. And so by achieving the elixir, it might be a sign that he's gained wisdom, even if he isn't ultimately able to bring that elixir back to his society. He might have failed the literal elixir of life, but not the metaphorical wisdom that he gained along the way. And I think the reason that we might see this is because when he is with Utnapishtim, he goes back to Utnapishtim after wrestling the ferrymen, after the plant gets eaten by the snake, and they kind of strike up this friendship and this positive relationship. So Utnapishtim is this positive figure for Gilgamesh. So even though Gilgamesh fails, it seems like he has gained wisdom. So Gilgamesh crosses the return world, and Gilgamesh is now the master of two worlds. He has grown from his journey, wisdom. He's not this, asshole anymore. He's a king who will actually take care of his people because he's learned about his own limitations, who he is as a person, and how to treat people and how to love people. Okay, so that's basically Joseph Campbell's take on the story of Gilgamesh. Let me know if you have questions.